Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 98th video in our Master Series and the 12th video in our subgroup mixing, and I do believe our third video in backing tracks. Tonight we're going to talk about drums. First of all, the first thing I want to get you to get through your head, your life will become much simpler dealing with any kind of drum kits with two things. First of all, you deal with them that they are a mix unto themselves, that you're more likely going to have to change that subgroup mix that's a mix unto itself once you actually start mixing it into the production. Does that make sense? And the second thing to get in your head is that different sections can be different. I used to hate drums because for the verse, I'd get the drums set up. They sounded perfect like that for the verse. And then I'd go to the break and the chorus, and it didn't sound good. So I'd have to change pannings, volume levels, all kinds of things. And I used to think it was frustrating because, I just wasn't in my head that I treat each section separately. So, I get done with the verse, like it's a simple song and there's a verse. Well, I'm going to copy all the pannings and volume that I've done that as automation onto the second verse that's the same. Because in the chorus, I might mix them a little bit differently so they sound good, because the kick and the snare might be doing different interplay with the bass or the guitar, or the toms might be interplaying with some other instrument, and so I might want to change it up so they sound as good as they can. That subgroup sounds as good as it can for each section separately. So it's just not like I turn the kick drum up to 5, and it's like, it's great for the whole production. Well, it might not be. So, and that goes with its panning and all the levels and mixing and everything you've done, because it might be different. In the next section, it might have to be panned a little bit different because of what's going on. The simpler the production, the less of that you have to deal with. The more complicated the production, the more you might have to deal with that. And just keep that in mind. And the next thing, number 3, is it's a personal preference, bro. Just because Bob does it that way, that doesn't mean you're going to do it that way. Just because if Timmy does it that way, it doesn't mean you're going to do it that way. And on and on and on and on, so you do not get frustrated. You need to learn about mixing your kick drum or mixing your subgroup of your drums yourself, how you like them. Now, that is impossible to teach. So basically, as you practice and you try different things, then you will eventually understand the things that you like, and for certain types of productions, or if you're genre oriented. So really keep those things in mind. And the other thing to keep in mind is reverberation on the higher end things, like your higher toms, your snares, sometimes your hi-hats and your crashes. You can get reverb on there. Be careful of reverb on your kick drum, bro. Even if you have to isolate it a little bit, because it can cause mud in your mix real quick and just really muddy your low end. The other thing to keep in mind is the drums and the bass are normally the rhythmical section of your production. One of them, the bass, is a musical rhythm part of your production. The drums are an acoustical rhythm part of your production. Both of them are part of the rhythm foundation of your production. One of them musical and one of them acoustical, and they work together. Now, you get those things in your head, and it'll make it much easier for when you start trying to mix your bass and your drums, that you see them that way and how they interplay and they do things together. And if you got a band that understands that, you can have a blast mixing, because you start mixing your drum kit and your bass together, and the band knew that and they work like that, then it becomes fun mixing the bass and the bass and the drum set, because they're really working together as musical and acoustical rhythm foundation for the production. So really keep those things in mind. Other than that, it's really a lot of personal preference. So one thing we had talked about in the last video, we were talking about the bass. Have it, doubled and inside or way out, 100% right and left maybe sometimes to make it wide because of the kick center. You can do the same thing here. You could double the kick drum or mic it with 2 different microphones, or sculpt one of them a little bit different and flan them way out. Does that make sense? But it can cause a problem. So a lot of times that with the drum set, that I do my work in processing a lot of times, and I try not to the basics of it, I'll try to keep it inside of 50. Except for, when you have sections where the drums are really the focal point, and then you deal with them just like they're out front tracks. And you can do really wild stereo feels, really wide pannings and stuff going on all over the place because they're the focus. And sometimes they're really, support focused. So when you see them like that, then you deal with them. But when they become backing tracks, then a lot of times it's, I keep it within 50 right and left. Like I might have the kick, 20 or 30 right, the snare 20 or 30 left, and I'm keeping everything else going out a little bit farther, like the toms I'll have a little farther. Sometimes the floor tom, it will kind of take the place of either the kick drum or the snare. Normally the place of the snare, if it's not just working with the toms, that you hit the floor tom, you're going along with he's hitting the kick drum and the snare, and then he hits the tom and the floor tom instead. That's kind of, so I kind of keep them close together. Normally, like the hi-hat, the floor tom's going to take the place of one of those two things unless it's working with the other toms on some type of a run. So I've got like this going right 30, left 30, and this one going, in the same place as the snare because they're, it's going to be hitting at the same time. Unless I go center, where if they're hitting at different times, and then I got the kick drum centered, and then the snare right 30, left 30, or something like that. And the ride acts a lot like a hi-hat, so you kind of want to mix it in with that. And the tom will normally take the place of one of those two hits. If the hi-hat or the hi-hat or the snare, the drummer's hitting it, a lot of times if he just kind of hits the floor tom, it'll be in the place of one of the hits of one of these two. So you kind of keep them panned in the same place, because they're not really hitting at the same time. But you might want to change that for certain sections if he's doing some kind of run on the toms with the floor tom working in conjunction with the kick and the snare or something like that. You have to work that. And another thing is drum effects. You might have some really cool drum effects in certain sections that you might have to rework your pannings and your volume levels and all kinds of things for it to work as a separate section. Like you're mixing that section as a different, subgroup drum mix for that section because it's got another element to it that's really pertinent that you can't leave things the way you had them so that it sounds as good as it can for each section. And overheads, people talk about overheads. Overhead microphones, that's okay. What an overhead microphone does is tries to capture the sound of the drum where the drum kit's at in some certain room, and then you want to bring that up underneath the rest of the drum kit that adds the spatialization thing. Now, if you've done that with all the band, great. If you haven't, get rid of it. That way that you can do a couple different things. You can run everything in here like to just running it straight. And then you can run all these also off to a send that has that preset we talked about, spatialization. So on all the subgroups and all the tracks, you've got that spatialization preset that we talked about. And you can put that on an FX send to where you can bring it in like an overhead. So it's like, now you've got the straight drums going through that subgroup, but also like an overhead, you've got them all sent on sends to an FX bus that has that spatialization preset that you can bring up into it, that it acts like an overhead, but much cleaner most of the time. Does that make sense? That way you don't have a lot of other stuff going on, and it's really difficult to get phase issues and things like that when you're trying to create spatialization for your drum track. So really keep that in mind. Other than that, drum kits are normally very simple, and it's a problem with personal taste, because a lot of times that I'll listen to people and they say, well, what do you want to do? What should I do with the drums? Well, what do you want to do with the drums? Because drums are like a separate mix. So your biggest thing is to mix it the way you want it. It's like mix it the way it sounds good to you as a separate mix unto itself, to where you can sit back and listen to that mix of that drum, that subgroup of drums, and it sounds great. Now, when you go into the mix and you start bringing it into the mix, you're more than likely going to have to change it. All of a sudden the kick needs to come up a little bit, the snare needs to go down, on and on and on, so that it rides well in the mix. And just keep that in mind, and that's okay. But as far as pannings and spatialization, there's no set way to do any of that stuff. I mean, a lot of times people will say they'll keep their kicks centered, and sometimes that's a great idea depending on what you got going on. Like, depending on how much spatialization you got going on. Or, if the kick is centered and the hi-hat and snare are really working off a little bit, 30 right and left or something. Or the kick's really working with the hi-hat and snare against them. So you got the kick panned left 30 and these two panned right 30 or something like that. Does that make sense? Where we had talked before, you had the bass panned out a little bit farther so it's not, in there, depending on how you set up the mix. So the problem with the drums is, a lot of times that you can look at this one or two ways, is that the bass and the drums work together as part of the rhythmical section or the rhythmical elements like we talked about. And then you are going to work with them until they're mixed out great sounding together into their two subgroups. Does that make sense? But, you really have, what is more important? Are they really a rhythmical thing or are they really a lot more integral into what's happening in the song? I mean, is the bass and the drums really integral in what's happening? Or are the people really not going to be paying attention to them as much other than the beat? And, really paying more attention to the guitar and the keyboardist and the vocalist out front. And they're, just to get their foot tapping. And then, it's not getting any more complicated than that. Or are they? So it really, how you mix your drums, it really has to do with how the flow of the song is going. So you really have to keep that in mind. Where accents are happening, are there parts of the drum that are accenting when other things are happening? Is there a backbeat that should be a little bit lighter, that's not taken away from something the guitar is doing, but it's kind of backing it, but off, not loud, or it should be the same as loud off to the other side, ba-bam, ba-bam, what, I mean, it's a really serious issue that the drums have a couple different roles. That, not only are they part of the rhythmical section with the bass, but also how integral they are to the musical element of the song rather than just rhythm. Because, in some music, the rhythm is really prominent, so you're going to have to bring those up a little bit and really take a lot more care on how you mix them, whereas sometimes they're a lot more secondary and, backing tracks to where you've got a kick drum and a backbeat snare going with the bass, thumping along something, but the focus isn't on them at all. And sometimes the bass is got the rhythm, but working more with the guitarist or something else. So it's working with the drum, but it's coming out of that element. It's more of a musical element than a rhythmical element. Does that make sense? And you really have to take that into consideration. So for you to really mix your drums well, that you need to take all those things into consideration and approach it with the mentality of what is its place. What is the place of the drum in the submix? What are their role? Does that make sense? And how are they working with the rest of the production? And what are they working with in the rest of the production? Sometimes in some sections, the drum kit is really backing tracks. And it's really just a rhythm back there, maybe a backbeat or something going on. And then that changes for a verse or a chorus or a break or something like that. So you have to rethink, have to remix it. Each section is a different mix, and you have to look at it a little bit differently for what its role is for each different section. And that information I've been trying to tell you here is much more helpful than me going, well, here, let's go ahead and mix this kick drum over here and the snare drum over there, and don't ought to do it, off you go. Because it really doesn't work that way. Does that make sense? So those elements that I've been trying to talk to you about are much more important for you to deal with. And remember, any of the things we've talked about so far in subgrouping, you can apply it to elements of your subgroup drum, subgroup also. So keep that in mind also. Just be real careful about mud and just causing too much mayhem going on that just causes a mess rather than causing something cool to happen. Just be very careful of that. And very careful of phase issues and very careful of reverb, especially on your lower end. And if you keep those things in mind as you start mixing your drums, that you will probably very quickly get some kind of thing going on that you're comfortable with. And you'll start to think a lot more about the production and its role in the production, that's going to very much be more dictating what you do. So peace, hope, love. I hope you enjoyed this video on our subgroup drums, and I'll see you in the next video.